In this last slide deck, I'm going to give you a brief introduction to group policies. You can take a class with whole units that cover group policies. There's a lot of things you could do with these, but the important takeaway here with group policies that I want to preface all this, uh, in some classes we talk about, there's actually a course you can take called IT Security Policy where we basically go through the formal process of defining policies for IT security. Things like password policies and acceptable use policies and all these different things that you could have written policies for and all the reasons you would do that. And of course we all understand that we have to have policies and procedures and so forth. But we talk about controls for those policies. If you have a policy that says all user accounts need to have a password that's a certain length with a certain level of complexity, there's really two ways to go about enforcing that policy. You can either tell everyone that they have to do this and maybe do some kind of an audit, or who knows, but hope that everybody does it, or you can have a technical control in place to enforce that policy. And for the most part, technical controls for IT security policies are usually things like firewalls, intrusion detection systems, antivirus, and so forth and so on. But one of the best tools we have for enforcing policies at the computer and user level is going to be group policy, at least for Windows. There may not be much of an analog for this in the Linux world, at least not centrally managed. You have things like SE Linux and so forth that do a pretty good job of enforcing some policies, but there's no easy way to centralize a lot of that stuff. But Windows, Microsoft Windows Server does a really great job of giving you a framework from which to enforce your policies. So normally, what we want to do is look at our policies that would apply to computers or to individual user accounts and try to find any technical controls that are available to us to enforce those policies in Microsoft Windows. One thing I usually caution against is going the other way. So a lot of times I'll see administrators that say, oh, look at all of this stuff that I have in group policy that I could use to enforce a good policy, and using that to drive their IT security policy development. So they'll say, well, Active Directory lets me limit all of this stuff that somebody could do, so I might as well use it, right? But it's better to, a better approach to all this is say, okay, here's my wish list of all of the things that I'd like to control. Let me see what technical controls I have available to me to enforce that list, rather than going through the technical controls that you might have and deciding whether or not you want to use it, which is a little bit less structured. So group policy objects is a list of settings that you can use to configure the user and computer operating environments remotely. And what's even more important than remotely is centrally, right? So you can configure, if you have a policy that says no user should be able to mount a USB, right? They shouldn't be able to just plug in a USB and mount the files on there and auto run it. You can enforce that policy globally in one keystroke. You can go in and configure group policy to apply that rule to all computers on the network. And then once that group policy is replicated out throughout the network, no one will be able to plug in a USB stick and be able to use it, at least not without the domain administrator's password, unless you configure it that way. All right, so a GPO scope defines which objects a GPO affects, and those objects, again, could be computers and users. And installing Active Directory creates two GPOs by default. There's the default domain policy and the default domain controllers policy. So the default domain policy applies to all the computers in the domain, and the default controllers policy applies only to domain controllers. So we have at least that level of granularity right out of the gate. So you can view, create, and manage your GPOs by using the Group Policy Management Console. So it's a completely separate management console from the ADAC, which we talked about previously. Each GPO has two main nodes in GPMC. There's the computer configuration and user configuration. So computer configuration are policies that we set at the computer level, and then user configuration at the individual user level. So you could have a policy that applies globally to all the computers, or to all the computers in a certain site or a group or an OU, for example. And here we can start to see where these OUs start to come into play. So I could group all of the computers in the accounting department, no matter where they're located in the organization, or no matter what domain they happen to be in, or what tree they happen to be in, and I can put them all into that OU, and then I can apply policies to that department in one fell swoop with the computer configuration. And then likewise user configuration. So you can apply policies to individual users. And I don't mean like individual users one at a time, but to groups and things like that that would apply to users. And you can kind of get a sense of how complex this could get because of all these different levels of hierarchy and all the different ways that this could be parsed out. So each node contains policies folder and a preferences folder. And here we have our first little screenshot of what this kind of looks like in the group policy management. All right, so 3 folders under the policies folder contains the following information. You have software settings, Windows settings, and administrative templates. So software settings enables administrators to install and manage applications remotely. So this is how you install and manage applications on a large network, at least those that support group policy. And then Windows settings contains name resolution policy node, the scripts extension, security settings, and policy-based QoS node. And then administrative templates contains the control panel, network printer system, and Windows components folders. So you'll find different things that you can control in these different nodes. So the policies folder contains the same 3 folders as the computer configuration node, but policies defined here affect domain users within the GPO scope. So again, you have your software settings, Windows settings, which includes script extensions and security settings node, and the folder redirection policy, and then administrative templates. So GPOs can be applied in 4 places. They can be applied on a local computer, at a site, the domain, and organizational unit. So what that means is, so on a local, and all of you could do this, on your local computer, even if you're not on a domain, you can open up group policy on a local computer and you can set group policy on a local computer. The thing about that, though, is it only applies to the local computer. So for example, that setting I talked about to not mount a USB stick, you could go into group policy on your own computer, not even on a domain, and you'll find the option to disable auto run, for example, which will, well, it won't completely prevent you from plugging in the USB, but at least it won't auto run any executable files on the USB stick. Then you could do that. The thing about that is you will find that you don't have all of the options that you have on a domain controller. So when you use group policy on a domain controller, you have many more options available to you. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, even if you make a change on the local computer to your group policy, it gets overridden by any group policies at the site level. And anything at the site level is going to get overridden by the domain level, and anything at the domain level gets overridden by the organizational unit level. So if you set a group policy object to do something at the organizational level, then no matter what you do at the local computer site level or domain level, it's going to get overridden at the organizational level. This can get a little confusing sometimes. This is one of the harder things about managing group policy is a lot of times you have these conflicting rules at these different levels, and you can't figure out why somebody can or cannot do something at their level because something above that is causing that to not get applied. And then you have to kind of set up these umbrellas that force settings to kind of filter around that user, and it can get really confusing if you do that a lot over time. But in any event, that's how GPOs are applied. And you'll see that when you go into your domain controller, you'll see site, domain, and organizational unit. And on a local computer, you can change things at the local level. The nice thing about this, though, is let's say we have a savvy user that says, hey, I can't auto-run my USB stick when I plug it in, and I really like to have that. So I'm just going to go into local group policy and turn that on. But that doesn't matter because if you set that at either the site domain or organizational unit level, it's going to get overwritten anyway and never apply that setting. And by the way, group policies are applied in that order, but they start with, I talked about how you have computer level group policy and you have user level group policy. So computer level group policies are applied when the computer turns on before you even log in, and user group policies are applied when the user actually logs in. So different types of group policies can be applied at different times. So in summary, and by the way, I don't think I did group policy justice here. It's a very brief introduction in this course to group policy, but we discussed this in much more detail in the follow-on to this course. So we talked about directory services, we talked about the X500 standard and LDAP and how that's related, and LDAP is kind of the DNA of how this distributed database works. We talked about the server manager to install AD. We talked about the first domain controller, which is our new forest and domain, which is our forest root domain. We talked about using AD to organize objects. We talked about the container objects and leaf objects. We talked about how leaf objects generally represent security accounts, network resources, GPOs, and so forth. We talked about the recycling bin, and then if you turn that on, you can't turn it off without reinstalling everything, but it's good to have it so you can revert back to an older setting if you make a mistake. We talked about AD objects that can be located easily and searched using the AD tools. We talked about the ability or the need to create multiple domains, trees, and forests, and how that can add complexity, but sometimes it's something that we need to have. We talked about partitions and some of the some of the different roles that we have, the FSMO roles that I talked about. So the operations masters. We talked about the forest is the most broadest logical Active Directory component, followed by the domain, and then trees and so forth. We talked about GPOs, which are all these different settings that you can configure on users and computers, which you can do remotely, and how those are applied to computers if you use those GPOs. And that concludes our unit. And this is probably one of the longer, more involved units in this course, but that concludes the unit on Active Directory. And throughout the rest of the course, so in the next batch of units, we're going to talk about some of the network services available in Windows. So we'll start talking about DHCP, DNS. We'll talk about we'll talk about TCP/IP and networking in general with Windows and how it's handled and approached by Windows Server 2012.